Today, we are talking about how doing less is scientifically proven to help you accomplish more, a lesson that we are taking from oak trees. This is the Parks and Restoration Podcast, the show for parks and natural resource professionals like you who want to be better leaders for your organization, for your community, and for the people and landscapes that you serve. I'm Chris Lee, Executive Director at Des Moines County Conservation, leadership consultant and professional speaker, helping mission-driven organizations build strong, thriving cultures.
And I'm Jeremy Yost, Natural Resource Technician with Potawatomi County Conservation, coming to you from the beautiful Loess Hills of western Iowa, where subtraction isn't just a math problem, it's how we manage prairies, woodlands, and even our own energy as land stewards.
All right, I like that. So we're going to start this out with a scientific study. So there's the study I heard about. I first heard about it on the Wild Turkey Science podcast. And I believe this was down in Tennessee. Researchers studied different treatment effects on oak trees. What they wanted to do was figure out how could they get oaks to produce more acorns. And so what they did was they took an area and they had a control area where they did nothing. And then they had an area where they fertilized the oaks. And then they had an area where they cut down half of them, just removed half the canopy. So what do you think happened here? Well, as you might imagine, nothing really changed in the control area. In the fertilization area, though, interestingly, zero effect, no additional increase in acorns whatsoever. Now, here's where it gets crazy. When they cut down half of the competing trees, all right, so they cleared half of the forest out, acorn production jumped by 65%. So 50% removal, 65% increase in acorn production. And even more interesting, just 11% of the trees, the super producers, you've heard this term before if you listen to past episodes, were responsible for almost a third of all the acorns. So 11% of the trees produced almost a third of all the acorns produced. Meanwhile, nearly half the stand barely contributed anything. So this is crazy, but I think there's some really great parallels that we could pull from this lesson in ecology to our roles as leaders and as professionals in the natural resources field.
Exactly. I mean, isn't that crazy that by actually taking away and doing less, we actually had this huge increase in productivity? Like we always just assume that adding more fertilizer, adding more this, adding more that, it's going to result in more. But that's not always the case. Sometimes the best results, the real results, come from subtraction by clearing away competition so that the healthiest trees finally have room to thrive. So we're managing that energy and allowing our super producers to actually take off and thrive. And it actually reminds me of another book, this one by Leidy Colts, called The Untapped Science of Less. Our brains are wired to solve problems by adding. We rarely stop to think, what could I remove to make this better? And yet, subtraction, it seems, is always a way that we're able to actually win more. Not by doing more, but actually subtracting allows us to win.
Yeah, and I mean, and I have seen this. Frankly, I'm in a situation right now where this came along just perfectly. In fact, we were going to record this last night, and I texted Jeremy when I got home from work yesterday, and I said, "Fair warning, I am tired and seriously pissy." And he's like, "We can reschedule if you want." And so we did, and we're recording now. But I am at a point at work and in life that I keep adding. And that's really what society tells us to do, right? Like society says you've got to do more. You got to make more money. You got to have the bigger house. You got to have the 2.5 kids. You got to have the nicer car. You got to have this more. Like if you got this job, you need to get the next job that's just one step higher up the ladder. And if you got that job, well, then you got to get the one after that. And then you got to get the one that pays a little bit more. And then it's an endless cycle of more. But we see in nature that has a what's the limiting returns. The more you add, it's not like you're getting necessarily more from it. And it's the law of diminishing returns. That's the term I was looking for. And it's not just in forests. I mean, leaders fall into the same trap, and I'm certainly in that boat now. We think productivity comes from adding more initiatives, more committees, more meetings, God forbid, more goals. But often the real productivity gains come from when we thin the stand. We ask ourselves, what can we remove in tasks and distractions, the underperforming projects that suck up energy without us moving closer to our mission? What can we take away to allow us to do the important stuff better. And one of my favorite books of all time is Good to Great by Jim Collins. And in that, he has this thing called the stop doing list. He said some of the greatest organizations, the ones that lasted the longest and went from a good organization or a good company to a great company where they outperformed their competitors and the markets for an extended period of time, they all had this idea of we do not do these things. We don't just add more for the sake of adding more. They were very, very clear on what it was that they did. He also has this thing called the hedgehog concept. What could you be the best in the world at? And it comes from this, I think it's a fable of, the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one thing. Curl up in a ball and put your spines out, right? And it did that. And he said that these companies that did that really seemed to outlast and outperform their competitors. And then Greg McEwen in the book Essentialism, he says that clarity comes when we eliminate the trivial many to focus on the vital few. And this seems to be true in oak trees. And I'm struggling with this right now in that I seem to have a lot of trivial many things going on in my life right now. And just this week, there was two or three other projects that got dumped in my lap are very worthy projects, but I'm struggling to fit them into my already busy schedule and what I thought I kind of had things prioritized. And so now it's like, okay, where does this fit in? And frankly, I'm bumping up against overwhelm, and I know that I can't do all of this stuff, and yet I keep trying, and so I'm not doing any of it well. And so yeah, I need to sit down and have this conversation or just be honest with myself of what can I cut out in order to free me up to do the stuff that I need to be doing well.
Right. And I think that if we think about that like law of subtraction, if we're just feeling like super overwhelmed, it actually relates to another thing that we think about all the time in our land stewardship here at Hitchcock and at other places that like it's all about a flow of energy. And so like you're saying that you're getting these things like added and added and added to your list. You only have so much energy to go around. And if we compare that to the natural world, all of the plants that we are managing for, all of their energy comes from the sun. And there's only so much of that sunlight to go away. And so if we were managing like our remnant prairies that are invaded by cedars, or we're managing our oak woodlands, we're really just like at the base of it, we're managing that light level or that energy level. And if we want things to take off, we have to take things away. It can't just be out there and continually adding and adding and adding. Every time that, we have a saying that shade never sleeps. And part of that is that, this idea that in the prairie, if we do nothing, it's just going to continue to be more and more cedar trees, more and more shrubs, more and more things on our plate that we're going to have to manage later. And so, like, really, we have to figure out not only on the land stewardship side, but our personal side too. Where is our energy going? Are there things that we can prioritize and figure out what's really important so that we're really managing that energy as best that we can?
And it's real easy to lose sight of what that priority is because what will often happen is we'll start prioritizing work and then work follows us home. And pretty soon we find ourselves pecking away on the computer in the afternoons or in the evenings or answering emails at the dinner table. And it just there's this creep of things that if you step back and ask yourself what is truly important, getting that email answered at 7 p.m. probably isn't it. And so there's a parallel here for leaders because this subtraction principle applies in our workplaces. So most of the time, the talent and the motivation we need is already there in our teams. Just like those native prairie species hanging out underneath those cedar trees, they're there. They're just waiting for their chance to thrive. They're just waiting for that energy to be right. And yet, oftentimes at our workplaces, ourselves and our team are buried under layers of busy work, the non-mission critical projects, the redundant reports, the meetings that have no sense whatsoever. All of that clutter, it blocks the energy from getting to where it needs to go. It blocks energy from flowing down to the people and the projects that need that. And so when leaders focus on subtraction, that removing the unnecessary, they free people up to do the work that they were hired to do. And when you do this in your own life, when you focus on subtraction and asking yourself, what can I remove off of here? Not what can I add? You can free yourself up to direct that energy and to cultivate that energy the way that energy would flow into a prairie. And, just like when that prairie bursts back to life, when you take out the cedars, people come alive when you cut away the junk that was stifling them and burying them. I've had this situation myself where, I would go to every county supervisor meeting. And at some point I concluded that most of them I didn't need to be there. I would show up and I'd give our department update. And so I made the decision that I didn't necessarily have to go to all of them. And rather than beating myself up of, oh, I'm missing the supervisor meeting, it was, no, I'm freeing my time up to do things that are more important than me just sitting there being another body in the room at these supervisor meetings. Now, I've been going to them here lately because they've been talking about a wind and solar energy ordinance, and so I need to be there as part of that conversation. But I'm also bringing my laptop with me. And during the parts of the meeting that don't apply to me, I try to get some work done. And so it's things like that. How can you free yourself up to focus on really what's important?
Exactly. And I think that if we start thinking about how do we actually like implement this, it's really, really important that if you do want to start subtracting, that you bring your people along with you so that it's not you're telling them that they're not no longer going to be doing this thing, or you're taking away things that they're truly passionate about. Just like relating back to the oak story, it was actually perfect timing that Chris was like, "Hey, let's wait and record until tomorrow," because this morning I got to actually go back and listen to that Wild Turkey Science podcast, and they brought up a really, really good point that the a part of this research was that they were actually going out and selecting the trees that were the least acorn producing trees. And so they were actually selecting for the high producers or the super producers. And so it's going to be really important that if you start subtracting, you're not subtracting the wrong things, and that you're lifting people up around you and bringing them along as a part of the process, so that you're not making sure that you're not getting rid of one of those super producers, which may be a task that someone may be really, really passionate about and really drives them forward. And they really they get their own energy from those tasks.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. And I'm beginning to believe this whole concept of super producers is a core function in nature. I need to explore this a little bit more because I think there's some opportunity here. But when you think about it, and we talked about this in our last episode, I think, and I think I'm jumping ahead in our outline here, but nevertheless, this seems like a apropos time to bring this up, is that if you go allowing your people to be buried under busy work, the first ones that are going to be like, I'm out of here, are the super producers. We saw it in the turkey data we talked about in the last episode, and they're going to be the ones that it's going to be an outsized impact on your organization and on your productivity if those are the ones that you're stifling. And so just like in this study, they went through and they found the least productive ones, and that's what they thinned. And this same thing would apply here, is find the least productive stuff that is consuming you and your people's time and start relentlessly taking it out.
Exactly. And this brings me to a really good example that we have here at Hitchcock that if anybody knows the what a lot of people will think as the invasive plant um, sweet clover, here at Hitchcock for 12 straight years, we would go out and cut sweet clover. And this involved covering all 1,000 acres of Hitchcock at the time with a weed eater on your back, carrying a weed eater and trimming the sweet clover at ground level so that we would, it would essentially die if you were cutting it at the peak of blooming. And there's not only one, but there's actually two species of sweet clover. And so there's yellow sweet clover and white sweet clover. And it just so happens that there's this time period where when they started, there was an overlap of yellow and white. So when they started this process of going out and covering all these acres and cutting all this sweet clover, it would take them 2 or 3 days at most. Fast forward 10 years to when I started, they had actually pushed the blooming period apart for yellow and white, so they no longer overlapped. They would have to go out, cover all of those acres for yellow sweet clover, then go out and cover all of those acres for white sweet clover. And
Jeez.
then we also found that if you didn't get it cut just right, it would actually come back and try to bloom again. And so at the peak, we were spending 3 straight weeks cutting sweet clover.
Oh.
Three
Oh,
straight weeks dedicated to just walking these acres and cutting sweet clover. And so we sat down and we said, what can we do about this? Like, how can we subtract? Because this is not sustainable. It was one of the most labor-intensive things that we did, the most time-intensive things that we did. And we had to sit there and say, like, is this actually effective? And is it something that we want to continue to invest our time in? And so we actually came to the conclusion that we decided to completely subtract it, completely stop cutting sweet clover. And for 3 growing seasons, guess what? Sweet clover has actually gotten better by us doing absolutely nothing.
what?
Yeah.
How?
Basically, we think that it is all related back to its life cycle as a biennial plant. And always, we started to connect these pieces that it was always in these areas that were the least intact. They were in areas that were grown up in shrubs. They were along edges that had hot fire that fall, and in restored prairies. It was basically, we didn't find it at all in the places that had been restored for the longest period of time. And so what we actually decided to focus on is getting rid of the shrubs and getting rid of those edge areas where the sweet clover was still hiding. And by actually taking away that shade and accelerating our pace at which we were restoring these areas, sweet clover became not a problem anymore.
So it's maybe a bit more of a pioneer species, and
Yep.
versus as a site matures, it kind of naturally falls away.
Exactly. So really it was, and 12 years ago they were just starting on this process of really like restoring on a larger scale and doing annual fire. And so the annual fire was actually stimulating those seeds as well
Mm,
and getting hotter fires moving into these kind of like newer areas. It seemed like this sweet clover was going to be an invading species.
yeah. Wow. Yeah, and so there's probably two lessons there. One, the lesson of subtraction of this is entirely too time consuming. We could be putting our time and effort towards something better. And then you've got a temporal lesson in here too, in that if you just play a longer game and think of your restoration in terms of a longer time period, then suddenly the dynamic changes significantly. You know, 3, 4, 5 years down the line, this thing might not even be an issue anymore if we stay focused on the mission of restoration and allowing the site to mature into the prairie that it wants to be. That's a some interesting insight there. See, this is why it's called Parks and Restoration, folks. There you go. I have seen, and I am one of the culprits of this, how leaders get this wrong. So it is so easy for us to be like, all right, here's this thing that's going wrong. Let's add something to fix this. You got a communication problem. Well, we just need to have more meetings then. Something isn't tracking well, or you're not getting the metrics captured. Let's add another report system. Your team's not aligned. They don't seem to be working on the right things at the right time. Let's add another strategic initiative or a whole series of meetings to roll this thing out and better get us aligned. And before long, this stuff just it keeps adding and adding and adding. Pretty soon you look back and you've piled on so much that the team is exhausted before they even get to go out and do that prairie restoration because they've got reports to fill out. I mean, I've heard this from colleagues across all sorts of different entities and organizations of like just to do a burn, the amount of bureaucracy that they've got to navigate before they can go out and do a burn. And yes, there's a safety issue here, and you got to have some of that, but some of it just, I mean, like it's just bureaucracy. It's like
Yeah.
it's reports and it's paperwork for the sake of reports and paperwork. It's this way with every grant, like every level of agency that you go up in terms of government. There's just layers of bureaucracy that gets added. You go from a state grant to a federal grant. Well, you better just hire somebody to do the paperwork. At work, we're just finishing up some FEMA stuff. That was from I don't know, three years ago, I think we finally just put the button on that. Just like, man, and so you look back and you're like, how did we become, that organization? That's that concept of the trivial many taking over the vital few.
Like we live it every day. Maybe sometimes it takes us 10 or 12 years to realize that we need to subtract something like cutting sweet clover, but an organization will actually crush under their own weight if they continue to just add and add and add and add things. And you can end up just like working people to the bone if you go from doing something that only took 2 or 3 days to it taking 2 or 3 weeks, like sweet clover. And if you're constantly adding, it's just going to end up leading to burnout. I mean, like you end up good people want to start thinking about leaving, or maybe just that their light starts to dim a little bit, their passion starts to dim a little bit. And, sometimes it might be even worse. Like if that light is starting to dim, they're starting to just sit there and like question themselves, like, why is my performance lagging? Like, why are these people just like starting to get so jaded? Why is it so difficult to just get things done? And these are things that can end up happening in any organization or any office when you're just adding, adding, adding. It can end up just leading to burnout. And we have to think about this when we're thinking about those super producers. How do we keep giving them the things that they need to get things done?
Yeah, and I'm certainly feeling that myself. I mean, I will admit right now, I am definitely feeling some burnout. And so I guess my recommendation would be, look, I guess I want to look at this through a kind of a structured approach. So how do we take this subtraction idea and apply it to what we do? And I think before you can take anything away, you have to decide what's truly important. And you got to decide what it is that you're absolutely going to keep. So we ran into this situation a few years back. We were bumping up a very significant budget cut. And I pulled my team together and I said, look, there are going to be things in our operations that are going away. So let's get very clear right now on what our non-negotiables are. What are things that we will not let go of, no matter what happens with the budget? We will forsake everything else before we let these things go. And so we got very clear on the things that we would not sacrifice when resources started dwindling. And I think that's what we've got to do as leaders and as professionals is we got to get very clear on what are we not willing to sacrifice? Like what is the end goal and what the reason we are here? Why is it we're showing up to work? It's getting back to that start with why that we just keep harping on almost in every episode we talk about on the show is what is that why? And get very, very clear on that. Because if you're not clear on that, if you are not clear on why it is you're showing up to work every day, then it's going to be very hard to decide what gets to stay and what gets to go. And what will happen is you'll become a victim of circumstance. And it'll be like, well, this seems like something that ought to stick here because, the supervisors say that this is important, or this partner agency, it's important to them. And so obviously it ought to be important to us. That's kind of what I'm bumping up against here. And so you've got to take a step back and say, okay, what is it that if I accomplish nothing else, what is the thing that I exist to accomplish here at my organization or in my life or in my professional career or whatever that is?
Exactly. Like if we do think about back to the oak study, like their why was obviously to produce more acorns. And so by cutting that 50% of the timber down, and that ultimate outcome is going to be producing more acorns, then you have succeeded. But another thing that they brought up in that Wild Turkey Science podcast today was to think about those trees that are not the super producing trees. What are they providing? There are things that we may not even know exactly what they are providing. And so you really have to think about what is your ultimate outcome. If the reason that those trees that weren't producing acorns, maybe they weren't producing because they actually like drier conditions. And as climate may be changing, they may be leading to there being drier conditions and they will become the super producers. And so you really have to step back and connect back what is your why, and then think about exactly what you're doing and how you can succeed in what you're doing.
Yeah. And so once you have that identified, then you can do an honest audit on what you and your team are doing and then decide on what contributes to the mission and what contributes to that why and what doesn't. And here, collaboration is absolutely key. This really is not something you can do on your own. And as a leader, it really is something you shouldn't be doing on your own because you're heading a team, and so that team needs to have a say in what does get done and what is important. It may be a tough conversation because there may be things that are ripe for the chopping block that are kind of people's darlings. Like, oh, we've been doing that for 30 years. So I'll give an example of that. So at Des Moines County Conservation, this was I don't know, several years back or a bunch of years back. I don't even know. It all blends together now. One of the first things that we acquired as a department, I think back in the 60s or 70s or something like that, was this one-room schoolhouse. And it, as you might imagine, with a 1800 and something one-room schoolhouse, is a maintenance nightmare. And way back in the day, we used to do programs there, and naturalists would, dress up and, look like one-room schoolhouse teachers would have looked like in 99 or something like that. And they would have these open houses. And we had stopped doing those for a long time because we didn't have time and it wasn't really our thing. And I think it was about the time we had these budget issues. And so we had to ask ourselves, is this one-room schoolhouse mission critical? Is having this thing and maintaining this thing and putting resources into this thing contributing to our mission of conservation and outdoor recreation? And we came to the conclusion that it's not. We are not an organization that does historic interpretation. And frankly, we had to put our resources to those places that were mission critical. And a one-room schoolhouse was not it. Now, when you make those tough decisions, what will happen is some people will disagree with those. And so then that conversation needs to be, okay, that's great. If you support this thing, then how can you be part of the solution to keeping it around? And what happened was a volunteer group formed to restore it. And since then, it's gotten a new roof and there's been some other work done to it. And it's been almost zero input from us because it's just not something that we have the resources to maintain. We did the same thing with, we had these folk concerts. We would have these concerts at our nature center. And these things went on for like 30 years. And they're very resource intensive. Our nature center staff had to, they had to make contact with the artists. And I don't know if you know anything about musicians, but sometimes they're a little flaky and they're hard to pin down. And sometimes they're a little less than responsive. And it was a lot of work organizing these things for zero return. Like we made no money off of it. It got some people into our nature center, but they were coming there for music. They weren't coming there for environmental education. And so again, we audited what we were doing and we said, these are not contributing to mission. These have got to go. And man, we caused some hell. I mean, these had been going on for a long time. And there are people today that will come in and be like, man, I remember the concerts. It really sucks that you got rid of those. And, and I hate that, but that was the tough decisions that we've got to make. And so and that's what falls on to us as professionals in this industry and as leaders, especially. Sometimes you've got to make those hard decisions. And so when you step back and you do that audit and you talk with your team and you say, okay, this is our North Star. For us, it was conservation and outdoor recreation. What are we doing that does not contribute to that? And then you do that from a big picture and then all the way down to the day-to-day stuff, like what meetings are we having that are getting in our way of being effective? And one of those for us was we eliminated monthly staff meetings. We used to have monthly staff meetings all the time, and it was a check-in. Our field staff would find out what the nature center staff is doing, and then everybody would find out what the admin staff was doing. We'd have these conversations. We threw those out the window, and now we just do quarterly, and we tie in field trips when we do it. And so it builds some camaraderie by going out and doing these field trips, and we get to go and see other places and learn from their operations. But then we get our catch up and, we catch up with each other and talk and do our meeting with that. And it's working just fine. And so, we went from 12 down to 4 meetings a year, and that's freed our staff up to focus on the stuff that's actually mission critical.
Yeah, that's awesome. I was just remembering back to Zion Schoolhouse and when that kind of volunteer group came together was when we decided to plant pollinator prairie around Zion Schoolhouse. I
Yeah.
mean, apparently just like make it look like beautiful flowers that also look like weeds, and then someone will take over the building for you.
Yeah, and they did. And that was the other thing. Is like we're not going to mow this anymore, and so we're like, well, let's put this into a pollinator mix. We did for a little while. I loved how it looked. I mean, I
Right.
thought the flowers around it, but some of the neighbors were not real thrilled about that, and they said, you know what? We'll just mow that for you. And so they do, and it's
Nice.
beautifully mowed. It looks like it's well taken care of, and we do nothing with it. And so it's been it's been a good outcome ultimately, but we had to make the decision that this just isn't working. We can't do
Right.
this anymore. And so, it
And
is okay to kill your traditions and kill your darlings sometimes, as long as you're doing it in the vein of mission and your overall why.
right. And I think that, those are examples of the what we do where we can subtract by what we do. But there's also some ways to prioritize or a little bit of the how do we do things that you can also find places to subtract there too. And so one of the things that over this summer has been a really kind of a sticking point for me is that on our Monday morning meetings, we would always come in with a super long list of things to do that always felt like they just weren't attainable in that week. We would have this long, long list, and then things would like continually just stay on the list. And we'd sit there and be like, it'll get prioritized at some point. It'll get prioritized at some point. And there were sometimes things that, just kind of ended up getting forgotten about because they would make it on the list and then they wouldn't be on the list anymore. And then we realized that they were important. And so a thing that we've tried to implement this summer is on our Monday morning meetings, we come in and actually prioritize things from the get-go. And so we structure it, thanks to my wife for this idea, by the way, but we structure it with what is going to happen this week, what could happen this week, and what's on our radar. And so that initially helps us prioritize and not feel so overwhelmed or miss things by these things that constantly got put on the list, these additive things that got put on the list that would sometimes feel get forgotten about. And so we ended up subtracting those things and prioritizing. And that really helped us to actually attain our goals for that week and, celebrate that success versus just feeling that pressure of this thing always sitting on the list.
Yeah. Yeah, having that thing that just carries over from week to week to week to week, that is so demotivating. I don't know what it is about that, but when that thing's just hanging out there like that it really wears people down. And so getting very explicit about this is what is getting accomplished. I did a webinar several months back on this, and it was on team alignment, and it was on the whole objectives and key results model, where you set this overall objective of, you know, so in our instance, one of them was get the nature center as pristine as it could possibly be outside. And so it's a bunch of outside work. And so then you break down the key results of these three things have to get done. So if nothing else gets done, these three things getting done equals success. And then being real about the situation and be like, okay, well, here's what could pop up, and knowing that stuff, and then also knowing that here's the things that are coming so that you can kind of see what's coming on the radar. And then as you move forward, those things that you see coming can then get promoted up into higher levels of priority. And I don't remember who it was that modeled that, but it's a common thing in the business world, common structure. And so there's obviously some function to that.
Yeah, for sure. And
The
it's really ended up helping us. Like also the on the radar part of it has helped us think about things that are connecting to other parts of the program as well. And so if we can keep it on our radar that we're going to have 10 volunteers splitting firewood in 2 weeks, we know that that date is coming, and it helps us prioritize getting everything ready for that on the lead end instead of just it being this overarching thing of like volunteers will be here this day. It actually helps us keep and prioritize those things with throughout the week and allows us to be ready for them when they're there.
Yeah. And like we talked about in the previous episode about how to eat an elephant, doing those big projects and bringing a bunch of people in to knock out a great big project, like that doesn't just happen. Like you can't just be like, hey, 45 people, let's come do the Prairie Day, and then you just wait for that day to come and then you go do it. Like the prep that has to happen ahead of that in order to make that successful is pretty enormous. And so working backwards off of those things, and then like you said, asking yourself, okay, how is there a different way we could be doing these things that reduces some of the workload? Is there redundancies in some of our operations? And there's a lot of ways of working that could be tweaked a little bit. Maybe something can't just get thrown out altogether, but is there a different way that it could be done that makes it more efficient and less time consuming, less resource intensive, whatever? And so it's asking yourself those questions as well as another way of subtracting. And when you get right down to it, all of this is just an experiment. You're going to have these conversations. People, oh well, we can't change that. And so approach it in the scientific way, just the same way that the researchers approach this oak tree study is, well, we think this might happen. We're going to try it and then see what happens, and then we'll adjust from there. So it's that's how science works. And so if you eliminate something, if you take something away, you can usually always bring it back. If we decided to stop mowing or maintaining Zion School, we could always start mowing and maintaining Zion School again if we wanted to, or we could always bring back the folk concerts if we wanted to. But it's an experiment, and so take them away remove it from your agenda. You know, you can always go back to having monthly staff meetings, but what happens if you did just go quarterly? And then are there systems that you can build that maintain the communication across departments so that everybody stays aligned and the communication still continues to flow? And those, that's a process thing. You can always go back to the way it was, but you're not going to know if something's going to work unless you give it a try. And so that's really, I guess, our suggestions is number one, be very clear about your why. Number two, audit what you're doing and ask yourself, are these things in service of that broader why? And then number three, start removing things and just experiment. It's okay to experiment, and you can always bring it back if you wanted to and see what that does and just pay close attention to the impacts that it has over time.
Exactly. Bringing others along with you on that process and then empowering them to say no. Really, like you end up building a culture where it's okay to question a request if it's not essential to that mission, to that why. Like that's not insubordination. That is a culture where you're actually allowing people to use the power of subtraction. And we as leaders can actually have the ability to model it. If our team sees us saying no to things that don't align with the mission, they'll feel safer to say so too.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up. I just had this happen. I think it was yesterday. And so this gets back to rewarding what you want. We talked about this in our culture episode. I think it was just the last episode is rewarding the culture that you want to establish at your organization. So one of the big things that's stressing me out and burning me out right now is there's a whole bunch of grants coming due in the next month. And one of these grants is a big forestry grant that we're going to be applying for. And so we met with our district forester and I told my natural resource manager, I said, hey, guess what? You get to write this grant. And he doesn't have a lot of grant writing experience. And so he says, so what's your estimation of time that this is going to take for a novice grant writer to put together? I'm like, it's not going to be insignificant. I mean, we're asking for 6 digits worth of funding. Um, and I know you are too. You know the program that we're applying for.
We
It's the,
are,
the
yeah.
Forest Resiliency
It,
Program. So
it's
we'll
a good thing there's like 3.5 million available because we're asking for a big part of it too.
right. So, good luck to you too. Dang it, we're taking our share. Arr. But I was like, hey, it's not going to be an insignificant amount of time. And so his next question was, so what am I not going to do to free me up to do this? And
Yes, that is perfect.
yeah. And my first reaction was like, figure it out, like just do it, damn it. But then, I checked myself and I'm like, man, I'm glad you bring that up because that's actually going to be one of the things we talk about in our next podcast episode. And I'm thrilled that that's what you bring up because this is the conversation we have to have. Because if I just dump something on my team and say, here, go get this done, and then they get that done, but then they don't get something else done that they already had scheduled, I as the leader and be like, why the hell didn't you get that done? And so, and anybody that's listening to this that has a boss probably has found themselves in this situation at some point as well. And so that's really that cultivating that psychological safety where it's okay to bring up, okay, what am I not going to do so that I have the time to do this? That's a conversation that has to happen, and that directly ties into the subtraction question of, okay, what can he take off his plate to free him up to write this ginormous grant that we're going to write? And it is mission critical. This is forest management, and it's directly related to conservation and natural resource management, which is our why and our North Star. Um, and so, yeah, we had a conversation around that, and we are going to move some staffing around to free his time up a little bit. He's going to work very closely with ChatGPT, and so again, getting that into some process stuff and how you do your work. We had some conversation around how that can help out, and so yeah, I mean it's still going to be a net gain to what he has to to his overall workload. But it was a good conversation to have, and we encourage everybody, just like Jeremy said, something else gets dumped on your lap. Ask the question, okay, what's going to go so that I am freed up to do this because you can't just add indefinitely.
Exactly. Speaking of grants, like this is the one thing that we're really going through at work too is that we had some long drawn out conversations this week about if we are able to get this grant and a couple other grants that we're applying for, like, our NAM program is going to significantly change because it's difficult to implement, like potentially we're asking for millions of dollars and hoping to manage with contractors over 1,000 acres. And so like our jobs are going to significantly change, and we have to sit down and be able to have that conversation about what are we going to subtract so that we do have time to implement these things.
Yeah. Again, that comes back to that timeline thinking of it's one thing to look at this grant due date that's coming up in 2 weeks, I think, and be like, oh, I'm going to get $120,000 or whatever, whatever the grant request is. It's something else entirely to be like, oh, once I have that money, then I'm going to have to go through the process of hiring contractors and then making sure that they're clear on the scope of work and then babysitting the contractors, make sure they're doing the work right. Where's that time going to come from? And so that's a great point, is that you got to think ahead and think into the
And
implementation phase of all this.
and exactly why, as a leader, you have to bring your other people along with you so that you can have that conversation of like, if we're making this change and subtracting these things to maybe add others, are we going to be okay with that? Is that going to drive our mission? And is it also going to drive you and the team forward personally so that you don't end up getting burnout of having to coordinate contractors forever, if that's the case or something that you're gonna have to do.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great note to end on. Bring your team with you is a good one to end on. So with that, we are going to wrap up this episode. Just remember, folks, it's not about what you add to your system. Just like with this oak tree study, what they found was that productivity increased the most when they removed half of the canopy. So be thinking about that as you go forward and you start looking at your workload and you're like, man, this seems like a lot. Start asking, how much of this canopy can I thin away? And then watch the productivity increase. We'll be talking about in our next episode.
Yeah, so speaking of, increased acorn production, our next episode's guest will be very happy with that. In our next episode, we'll be talking about how squirrels don't build dams and what it means for leadership. So if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the show so that you don't miss out on future episodes. And while you're at it, leave us a rating and a review. We're also on Instagram. Don't forget about that. So be sure to follow us there too.
Yeah. In fact, I got on Instagram the other day for the first time, and I don't know, maybe like the third time this year, I guess. I don't like getting on the socials, but I saw the picture of our brag board there at the nature center, so that was pretty cool. But so yeah, be sure to do that, folks. Better leaders, better parks. This is the Parks and Restoration Podcast, where every other Tuesday we share strategies to help you, the parks and natural resource professional, develop into the leader that your organization, your community, and future generations need you to be. Thanks for all you do out there. We'll talk again in a couple weeks, and in the meantime, see what you can subtract from your workload. We'll talk to you soon.